A single misplaced shovel can rewrite the story of humanity. Our entire past is built on a handful of colossal archaeological errors, mistakes that sent history spiraling down the wrong path for centuries. By the end of this journey, you will discover the 26 unimaginable blunders that permanently warped our understanding of ancient worlds. We will explore how a forged skull misdirected science for generations, and why a legendary city was almost lost to reckless digging. This is not just about lost artifacts. It is about how easily the truth can be buried by ambition and assumption. What part of history do you suspect might be completely wrong? The hunt for Troy began not with a careful map, but with a dog-eared copy of an epic poem. For generations, scholars treated Homer's Iliad as a literal treasure map, sending expeditions to dig across Turkey, based solely on poetic descriptions of windswept plains and distant mountains. They were so captivated by the story that they ignored the actual landscape, wasting decades and vast resources on barren hillsides. Then came Heinrich Schliemann, a man driven by equal parts obsession and wealth. He too was initially misled, convinced that a site called Banarbashi was the legendary city. His teams dug there first, only to find nothing of significance. It was a costly misstep, one that destroyed layers of other historical evidence in the process. His eventual triumph at the Mound of Hisarlik was almost a matter of stubborn luck, a correction born from his own earlier failure. The real tragedy of this era was the validation it provided. By finding a city that roughly matched Homer's tale, Schliemann inadvertently convinced the world that myth and history were one and the same. This created a dangerous precedent, encouraging a generation of treasure hunters to raid ancient texts instead of studying the soil. The misplaced search for Troy stands as a permanent warning against romanticizing the past. It proves that a compelling story is the most seductive and most destructive form of misdirection. How many other legendary sites remain hidden because we are looking in the wrong place, guided by fiction instead of fact? This early blunder in locating a fabled city pales in comparison to the next era, the wholesale destruction of an entire cultural record. Knowledge itself went up in smoke. The slow, agonizing destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not a single fire but a cascade of failures, a civilization repeatedly turning its back on its own memory. This was not an excavation error but something far more profound, a catastrophic failure of preservation. Imagine the sheer scope of what was lost: scrolls containing the only copies of plays by Sophocles, the precise astronomical charts of Babylonian priests, and medical texts that would not be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. This was not merely a building burning, it was the collective mind of the ancient world being erased. The error was in the political indifference and the social chaos that allowed this to happen, not once, but over and over, through multiple conflicts and regimes. Each act of vandalism, each new fire, chipped away at the foundation of human understanding. The void this loss created is almost impossible to measure. It set entire fields of science and history back by centuries, forcing scholars in the Renaissance and beyond to painfully reinvent what had already been discovered, or worse, to build their theories on the scattered, second-hand accounts that survived. How many cures for diseases were forgotten in those flames? How many entire cultures had their only written records turned to ash? We are left with a ghost of a library, a haunting silhouette of what we once knew. The tragedy is that this was a self-inflicted wound, an era of collective negligence that shrank the world's knowledge forever. Yet, even when artifacts survive the centuries, they face another kind of peril, one born not from neglect, but from a desperate desire to make them fit a predetermined story. That corroded lump of bronze pulled from a shipwreck was initially dismissed as nautical scrap. It was catalogued and stored away, a curiosity at best, while the true magnitude of the error unfolded in its silence. For nearly half a century, the Antikythera Mechanism sat in an Athenian museum, its purpose completely misunderstood. The archaeologists who first handled it were simply not equipped to see it for what it was. Their vision was clouded by a persistent and arrogant assumption, the belief that technology of such complexity could not possibly exist in the ancient world. They saw a corroded gear and thought of a simple clock or an ornamental piece, never dreaming it was a sophisticated analog computer. This was not a minor cataloging mistake. It was a fundamental failure of imagination that kept one of humanity's greatest mechanical achievements hidden in plain sight. The device was a masterpiece of Hellenistic engineering, capable of predicting planetary movements, lunar cycles, and even the timing of athletic games like the Olympics. Its intricate bronze gears formed a mechanical cosmos, a working model of the universe as the Greeks understood it. Yet, because it did not fit the established narrative of ancient technological simplicity, it was relegated to a storage drawer. The truth only began to emerge when a physicist took an interest, using then-new X-ray technology to peer inside the corroded mass. The images revealed a stunning complexity of interlocking gears, a level of precision that should not have existed for another 1,000 years. The error in recognizing the Antikythera Mechanism forced a complete rewrite of scientific history. It proved that ancient Greek ingenuity reached heights we had refused to believe, that they had built machines that would not be rivaled until the rise of European clockwork. This single misjudgment kept us in the dark about a pivotal chapter of human innovation. It makes you wonder what other marvels are currently sitting in museum basements, tragically mislabeled as mundane junk, simply because we are not yet ready to understand them. This failure to recognize technological brilliance is often paired with an equally damaging mistake: the rush to attribute ancient wonders to anyone but the people who actually built them. Across the American continent, great earthen pyramids and sprawling geometric shapes rose from the landscape, silent testaments to a deep and complex history. Yet for generations, archaeologists looked upon these monumental Native American mounds and saw something entirely fictional. They invented a lost race of mound builders, a mysterious, light-skinned civilization they believed had been wiped out by the very native peoples who lived there. This was not a simple mistake. It was a deliberate error born from prejudice, a refusal to accept that the ancestors of contemporary indigenous nations could have been master engineers and astronomers. The evidence was everywhere, from the massive serpent effigy in Ohio that aligns with solar events to the towering city of Cahokia near the Mississippi, yet it was all explained away by a convenient myth. This false narrative served a terrible purpose. It helped justify the seizure of ancestral lands and the forced removal of native peoples. If they were merely recent arrivals who had destroyed a superior culture, then white settlers were not displacing rightful owners but reclaiming a lost inheritance. The truth only began to emerge through the meticulous work of scholars like Cyrus Thomas, who used systematic excavation to prove a direct cultural link between the mounds and living Native American communities. The real error was not just a misidentification. It was the creation of a ghost civilization that actively erased the magnificent achievements of the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian cultures from the popular imagination. Their sophisticated societies, trade networks spanning continents, and architectural genius were all credited to pale, invented ghosts. How many other foundational stories of a nation are built upon such a willful denial of indigenous genius? This pattern of dismissing incredible accomplishments, of looking for a mysterious builder instead of accepting the truth in front of us, echoes across the globe, even to the most remote islands on Earth. The massive stone heads of Easter Island stood in silent judgment of the European explorers who discovered them. Those first visitors did not see monuments of a living culture. They saw only a barren landscape and giant, inscrutable faces, leading them to invent fantastical origins. They spun tales of a sunken continent or a vanished race of giants, completely bypassing the Rapa Nui people who lived among the statues and held their history in oral tradition. This was the foundational error, a profound cultural disconnect. Early archaeologists compounded the mistake, arriving with their own preconceptions. They meticulously studied the moai themselves but showed little interest in the people who carved them. They ignored the sacred Ahu platforms upon which the statues stood, and they dismissed the island's ecological story, which was written in the soil and pollen samples. This narrow focus gave rise to a persistent and damaging myth, the idea that the Rapa Nui people had descended into a frenzy of ecological suicide, cutting down every last tree in a mad, competitive race to erect statues. This narrative of a self-inflicted apocalypse was a gross oversimplification, a convenient story that blamed the victims for their own societal collapse. Modern archaeology, finally listening to Rapa Nui voices and employing rigorous science, tells a far more complex and human story. It reveals an island society that was resilient and adaptive, facing not just resource depletion, but also the devastating impacts of climate shifts and, most critically, the arrival of European diseases and slave raiders. The moai were not the cause of a collapse. They were the centerpieces of a sophisticated culture that was ultimately shattered by external forces. The initial error of ignoring indigenous knowledge created a century-long detour in our understanding, forcing us to unlearn a simplistic and incorrect tragedy. What other ancient collapses have we fundamentally misunderstood because we refused to listen to the descendants of the builders? This failure to see the culture behind the stone finds a disturbing echo in the way an entire city was once stripped of its true identity. The stones of Jericho hold a story far older than any biblical conquest. Early archaeologists, hungry for proof of divine intervention, approached the Great Tell not as a historical puzzle but as a confirmation of Scripture. John Garstang, digging in the 1930s, uncovered a collapsed wall. His eagerness transformed this finding into definitive evidence of Joshua's famed battle, a discovery that seemed to perfectly align faith with fact. The world celebrated, and for decades textbooks presented this as settled history, yet this certainty was the error. Garstang's timeline was a product of desire, not data. He saw what he wanted to see in the strata, forcing the complex layers of one of humanity's oldest cities to conform to a single, dramatic story. It took the meticulous, grid-based excavations of Kathleen Kenyon decades later to unravel the mistake. Her rigorous methods revealed the terrible truth that the destruction layer Garstang had so confidently identified actually dated to a period centuries before Joshua was ever said to have walked the earth. The wall that fell was not brought down by Israelite trumpets, but by a much earlier, entirely different catastrophe. The city linked to the biblical narrative was, in archaeological terms, simply not there. This misdating created a historical ghost, a verified event that never was, and it demonstrates a peril that haunts the entire field. When you begin a dig seeking to prove a story, you risk becoming blind to the true story the earth is trying to tell. How many other supposed confirmations of ancient texts are just waiting for a more careful scientist to come along and correct the record? This desperate need for validation can push beyond simple misidentification, spiraling into something far more deceptive. The Piltdown gravel pit yielded exactly what the scientific establishment wanted to see. In 1912, amateur Charles Dawson presented a skull that seemed to solve the puzzle of human evolution, a specimen with a human brain case and an ape-like jaw, perfectly bridging the gap. It was called the Piltdown Man, and for over 40 years it was celebrated as Britain's greatest contribution to paleoanthropology, the ultimate missing link found right in an English quarry. The error here was not just one of misidentification, but of collective, willful blindness. The scientific community, eager for proof that humanity's cradle was in Europe and not Africa, embraced the find with shocking speed. National pride and a deep-seated confirmation bias overrode healthy skepticism. The peer review process, still in its infancy, failed completely. No one with proper authority ever subjected the bones to rigorous chemical testing, and those who privately voiced doubts were dismissed as jealous or unpatriotic. This was not a simple prank that got out of hand. It was a meticulously crafted fraud that poisoned the well of human origins research for generations. Piltdown Man became the textbook example, the reference point against which all other hominid fossils were measured, and in doing so, it completely warped the narrative. Authentic discoveries from Africa, like the Tong child, were ignored or ridiculed because they did not fit the Piltdown model. A genuine key to our past was shoved in a drawer for decades, while a fake one sat on a pedestal. The cost was immense, squandering research funds, derailing careers, and most tragically, delaying our understanding of our own African origins by nearly half a century. The eventual exposure in the 1950s was a seismic humiliation, revealing the jawbone to be from a modern orangutan, chemically stained and filed down to fit the narrative. The Piltdown Forgery stands as archaeology's most embarrassing scandal, a permanent monument to the dangers of wanting something to be true so badly that you abandon the very principles of science. It forces us to ask what widely accepted truths today are being propped up by our own cultural desires, waiting for a future generation to finally see the cracks. This catastrophic failure of verification shows how easily ambition can override evidence, a problem that can occur even when the artifacts themselves are completely genuine. Heinrich Schliemann's triumphant discovery of Troy was a catastrophe in disguise. The man who proved the city was real also ensured we would never fully understand it. His error was not one of location but of method, a brutal assault on the past in the name of uncovering it. He treated the delicate, layered tell of Hisarlik like a quarry, hiring a small army of laborers to carve a great trench straight through the heart of the mound. This was not archaeology, it was industrial mining, driven by a frantic obsession to find Priam's legendary treasure and the Troy of Homer's epic. In his frenzied rush, Schliemann indiscriminately destroyed countless artifacts and, most critically, the stratigraphic context of the upper layers. Imagine a book with thousands of pages, each one representing a different era of history, from Roman markets to Hellenistic temples, all stacked in precise order. Schliemann did not raid this book page by page. He took a bulldozer to it, scrambling the pages forever. He unknowingly bulldozed right through the very Bronze Age city he sought, callously removing and discarding the evidence from later periods as worthless overburden. This lack of any systematic, layer-by-layer excavation meant that the relationship between different historical periods at Troy was obliterated. While he proved the city's existence, his reckless haste made it impossible for anyone to ever reconstruct a precise timeline of its occupation, its growth, its trade, and its multiple destructions. His work set a terrible precedent for early archaeology. teaching a generation that the goal was the spectacular find, the golden hoard, not the careful, contextual recovery of a civilization story. What detailed chronicles of Hellenistic life were tossed aside as dirt? What Roman inscriptions were shattered by his picks, all for the glory of a single, earlier prize? We possess the golden masks he famously photographed his wife wearing, but we lost the mundane, daily records that truly explain how people lived and died in that legendary place. This reckless pursuit of treasure, this prioritization of myth over meticulous science, leads us directly to another era born of the same destructive greed and haste. The gold of Ur was a whisper from the dawn of civilization, but we only heard half the story. By the time Sir Leonard Woolley began his celebrated excavations in the 1920s, the Royal Cemetery had already been savaged. Local looters and earlier profit-driven excavators had tunneled through the sacred ground for decades, their eyes fixed only on the gleam of gold and lapis lazuli. They ripped lyres inlaid with bull heads from the hands of skeletons, tore beaded necklaces from royal necks, and shoveled delicate cylinder seals into bags to be sold on the anonymous antiquities market. Their error was a fundamental misjudgment of value. They saw treasure where scientists would later see text, treating each artifact as a simple commodity rather than a single word in a complex historical sentence. The true wealth of Ur was not in the metal itself, but in the precise arrangement of these objects, the way a queen's crown was placed near a specific servant, or how a particular type of pot was clustered in a corner, telling a story of trade with distant lands. When those items were violently pulled from the soil and scattered across the globe, that story was shredded. Museums might display a beautiful gold dagger from Ur, but without knowing which body it was buried with or what other objects lay beside it, it becomes a beautiful mystery, its voice forever silenced. We can marvel at the craftsmanship, but we can no longer hear it explain the social hierarchy of Sumer, its elaborate funerary rituals, or the vast economic networks that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Egyptian Nile. What specific king did that magnificent golden helmet once belong to? We will never know because the context that would have identified him was sold for scrap. The commercial looting of Ur created a phantom history, a grand civilization whose most intimate details are now permanently out of reach, replaced by a collection of beautiful but disconnected trinkets. This violent separation of an object from its story finds a strange parallel in our next era, where an entire culture was not looted, but completely invented by the very people who claimed to be studying it. For centuries, the only sound at Stonehenge was the wind sweeping across the plain, a silence that invited wild speculation. The towering stones became a blank slate for every generation's fantasies. Early antiquarians, gazing at the massive trilithons, refused to believe that ancient Britons could have engineered such a marvel. They credited the monument to everyone from Roman engineers to the mythical wizard Merlin, with the most persistent error being its wholesale attribution to the Celtic Druids. This was a chronological absurdity, as the Druids flourished over 1,000 years after Stonehenge was already ancient. This fundamental misdating created a romantic but utterly false narrative, turning a sophisticated Neolithic temple into a simplistic stage for robed priests. The deeper error was one of isolation. Archaeologists for generations treated Stonehenge as a solitary wonder, a temple standing alone in the landscape. They dug trenches around the stones themselves but failed to see the connections radiating outwards. This narrow focus blinded them to the truth that the Great Circle was merely the monumental heart of a vast, interconnected ritual complex. It was not a destination but the climax of a sacred journey. The pivotal correction came from the skies, not the soil. In the 1960s, an astronomer named Gerald Hawkins used early computer analysis to demonstrate that the arrangement of stones, lintels, and the enigmatic heel stone functioned as a precise astronomical calendar. It could predict solstices, equinoxes, and even complex lunar cycles. This revelation, born of archaeoastronomy, shattered the Druidic myth. It proved the builders were not primitive sun worshippers, but master astronomers who had encoded their understanding of the cosmos in stone. Modern archaeology has since painted a breathtakingly complex picture. Geophysical surveys have revealed that Stonehenge was connected by processional avenues to other massive sites like the Durrington Walls settlement and the Woodhenge Timber Circle. This was a landscape for the dead, a place where ancestors were venerated and where communities gathered from across Britain for seasonal feasts and ceremonies that lasted for over a millennium. The early era of seeing a single, static temple prevented us from understanding a living, breathing ritual landscape that pulsed with seasonal and spiritual significance. What other iconic monuments are we still viewing as isolated ruins, when in reality they were just one piece of a much grander, interconnected whole? This failure to see the bigger picture, to restore context to a single site, pales in comparison to the damage done when restoration itself becomes an act of historical destruction. The vibrant red columns and sprawling staircases of Knossos feel like a time traveler's perfect postcard. You walk through a fully realized Bronze Age palace, but this vision is a mirage, a beautiful era cast in concrete and steel. Sir Arthur Evans did not just excavate the Minoan capital, he rebuilt it. His ambition was to resurrect a lost civilization from the rubble, and he used modern materials to bring his personal fantasy of a peaceful, matriarchal society to life. The error was not in his enthusiasm but in its permanence. He poured concrete to reconstruct entire walls, installed steel beams to support grand staircases, and hired an artist to repaint frescoes based on tiny, surviving fragments. In doing so, he fused his Edwardian imagination with authentic Minoan foundations, creating a hybrid monument that can never be untangled. Future archaeologists arriving at the site are confronted with an impossible puzzle, unable to discern where the original stonework ends and Evans's speculative reconstruction begins. Was this particular column base truly Minoan, or was its shape dictated by his own aesthetic sense? The very layout of the palace, which he presented as historical fact, is now understood to be largely his own invention, a blueprint for a society that may have never existed in that form. He gave the world a stunning tourist attraction at the cost of scientific integrity, prioritizing a compelling visual narrative over the messy, ambiguous truth of the ruins. His Knossos is a magnificent forgery, an archaeological theme park that has cemented a specific, and likely flawed, image of the Minoans in the public mind for over a century. How many textbook illustrations of Minoan priests and bull leapers are actually based on Evans's artistic commissions rather than hard evidence? This dangerous blurring of discovery and invention finds an even more personal and poignant expression in the next great era, where the story of a single skeleton was rewritten to fit a heroic myth. The Roman Forum we walk through today is a beautiful lie. For centuries, this political and spiritual heart of the empire lay forgotten, a field of broken marble buried under 20 feet of earth and medieval churches. Then came the 18th and 19th century excavators, armed not just with shovels but with a powerful romantic vision. They were not there to simply uncover history, they were there to rebuild a dream. Their primary tool was a practice called anastylosis, the re-erection of fallen structures using original fragments. It sounds like careful preservation, but in practice, it was a form of architectural guesswork. Columns were hoisted upright and cemented into place, often on foundations they never originally stood upon. Architraves were balanced on top, creating a picturesque skyline of ruins that was more pleasing to the romantic eye than it was accurate to the ancient reality. The goal was to create a stage set of classical grandeur, a clean and orderly monument to a lost golden age. To achieve this aesthetic purity, they committed an unforgivable act of historical cleansing. They systematically demolished the medieval churches, workshops, and houses that had been built atop the ancient ruins. With every cartload of medieval stone they hauled away, they were erasing 1,000 years of continuous human habitation. They were not just removing rubble, they were deleting the Byzantine, medieval, and Renaissance layers of Rome's story, all in service of revealing a single, idealized classical period. The era was a profound failure of perspective. They saw the later periods as clutter obscuring the true masterpiece, rather than as integral chapters in the site's long biography. What did we lose in this sanitizing sweep? We lost the humble homes of medieval Romans who adapted old temples into new dwellings. We lost the churches that preserved the very marble they were built from. We lost the context that showed how a center of pagan power slowly transformed into a Christian world. The Forum we see now is a hybrid, a carefully curated park that is as much a product of 19th century Romanticism as it is of 1st century Roman engineering. It is a silent, majestic ruin, but it is no longer the messy, vibrant, and layered city center that pulsed with life for millennia. This preference for one glorious era over all others makes you wonder what other sites have been permanently frozen in a single moment in time, their full, rich stories sacrificed for a simpler, more beautiful fiction. This desire to clean up the past, to make it conform to an idealized image, finds a deeply personal and tragic expression in the next era. The Rosetta Stone was a prize of war long before it became a scholarly treasure. Its celebrated discovery was not a moment of careful archaeology, but a chaotic byproduct of military conquest, ripped from a wall near the Egyptian town of Rashid by French soldiers. When the British Army later claimed it as a spoil of war, the stone began its life in European collections, completely divorced from the world that created it. This physical removal was the first and most profound error, an act of colonial appropriation that stripped the artifact of its voice. The stone was not a standalone monument. It was part of a larger temple complex, its trilingual decree embedded in a specific sacred and political landscape. By tearing it from that context, the French and British ensured we would never fully understand the local significance of the proclamation it carried. The text itself became a global celebrity, but the reasons it was erected in that particular temple, for that particular audience, were lost forever. The errors continued in the frantic race to decipher it. For decades, brilliant minds stumbled over the hieroglyphs, not from a lack of intelligence, but from a surplus of assumption. Scholars like Thomas Young made progress, yet they were often trapped by the flawed idea that the Egyptian script was purely symbolic, that each glyph represented a whole concept or object. They tried to force the ancient language to conform to their own philosophical frameworks, seeing mystical allegories where there was phonetic spelling. It was Jean-François Champollion's breakthrough, his realization that the script was a complex mix of phonetic and ideographic signs that finally cracked the code. But his success was built upon the rubble of countless failed attempts, errors born from a refusal to let the text speak for itself. The stone's legacy is thus a paradox. It is both the key that unlocked ancient Egypt and a permanent symbol of how that knowledge was acquired through power rather than partnership. Its home in the British Museum is a testament to its immense value, Yet its very presence there is a constant reminder of the colonial practices that displaced countless cultural treasures. How many other inscriptions remain incomprehensible because the temple walls they were carved on were dismantled for building stone, or the steels they were written on were hauled away as trophies? This focus on a single, spectacular key can blind us to the larger system it was meant to open. The silent terracotta army stood guard for over 2 millennia before a farmer's well broke the seal on their hidden chamber. When the world first saw those thousands of life-sized soldiers, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Every headline, every documentary, every museum exhibit centered on the warriors themselves, their unique faces, their intricate armor, their silent, massed ranks. This fixation, however, contained a subtle but critical error of perspective. We became so mesmerized by the spectacular army that we largely treated it as the main event, a standalone marvel of ancient art. In doing so, we risked forgetting what the soldiers were actually there to do. They are not the treasure, they are the guards. Their entire purpose, their reason for existence, was to protect the true heart of the complex, the immense, undisturbed tomb mound of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, which lies just over a mile away. The error was in allowing the most accessible part of the discovery to overshadow the far greater and far more mysterious whole. Early interpretations, dazzled by the sheer number of figures, could easily have led to a fragmented understanding of the emperor's grand design. This was not merely a massive burial. It was a bid for immortality, a recreation of the entire cosmos under a man-made mountain. Ancient texts describe the tomb's interior as a miniature universe, with starry ceilings crafted from pearls and jewels and rivers of shimmering mercury flowing through a bronze landscape. By focusing only on the terracotta vanguard, we risked underestimating the sheer scale of Qin Shi Huang's ambition and the absolute power he wielded to make it real. The true archaeological prize has always been the tomb itself, a time capsule from the dawn of a unified China that remains sealed due to immense technical and ethical challenges. How do you excavate a site that historical accounts claim is riddled with booby traps and pools of toxic liquid mercury? The unanswered questions are what make the initial focus on the army such a poignant lesson. It reminds us that the most spectacular find is not always the most important one, and that our gaze can be captured by the glittering surface, blinding us to the profound depths just beneath. What other monumental discoveries are we only seeing a small, tantalizing part of, while the main chamber of secrets remains hidden and waiting? This tendency to focus on the part we can see, rather than the vast system it belongs to, is a recurring theme, one that becomes even more pronounced when we shift from a single tomb to the study of an entire, misunderstood civilization. The Minoan world was not the gentle paradise we were led to believe. For nearly a century, the civilization of Crete stood in textbooks as a beacon of peace, a serene, goddess-worshipping society that shunned warfare for art and ceremony. This was the grand era of the Minoan peace, a myth crafted not from the evidence itself, but from the deep-seated ideals of its primary excavator, Sir Arthur Evans. Living in the tense, war-shadowed early 20th century, Evans yearned for a historical alternative. He projected this desire onto the ruins of Knossos, meticulously downplaying any finding that contradicted his utopian vision. He dismissed substantial perimeter walls as mere terrace supports. He catalogued swords and spearheads as ceremonial objects or hunting tools, never for conflict between people. His focus remained fixed on the vibrant frescoes of leaping dolphins, graceful processions, and the thrilling, dangerous spectacle of bull leaping. He built a narrative of a matriarchal society led by compassionate priestess queens, a vision that was academically seductive and powerfully appealing. The truth, as later archaeologists would uncover, was far more gritty and familiar. Beyond Evans's reconstructed palace, excavations across Crete revealed settlements fortified with genuine defensive walls, some remarkably thick and complex. Armories were found stocked not with ritual props, but with practical, deadly weapons designed for combat. Perhaps most chillingly, evidence emerged from sites like anemospelia of human sacrifice, a practice undertaken in moments of extreme societal crisis, such as a devastating earthquake. The bones told a story Evans had refused to hear. The Minoans were not pacifists. They were a formidable maritime power, a competitive kingdom or collection of rival states that protected its trade routes, projected its influence across the Aegean, and engaged in the same brutal realities as every other Bronze Age society. The era of the Minoan piece demonstrates how a single influential voice, armed with a compelling personal narrative, can whitewash an entire civilization for generations. It replaced a complex, powerful culture with a romantic fairy tale, obscuring their true achievements and their very human struggles. What other ancient societies have we similarly sanitized, turning them into simplistic mirrors of our own hopes and fears? This misinterpretation of social structure is a recurring theme, one that finds a stark and tragic parallel in the jungles of the Americas. The silent jungle swallowing stone pyramids seem to tell a story of abrupt and total ruin. For generations, archaeologists stood before the vine-choked temples of Tikal and Palenque and saw the aftermath of a single, swift catastrophe. The narrative was irresistibly dramatic, a grand civilization struck down by an unknown disaster around the year 900, leaving its magnificent cities empty and its people vanished. This vision of a sudden collapse was a profound error of oversimplification, a story we told because the silent ruins demanded an explanation as grand as their scale. We imagined a great invasion, a devastating plague, or a violent peasant revolt, a clean break that neatly separated the classic Maya from the jungle that reclaimed them. The truth, uncovered through decades of interdisciplinary work, is far messier and more human. There was no single villain, no lone catastrophe. Instead, a perfect storm of pressures slowly fractured the foundations of Maya society. Paleoclimatologists studying sediment cores from nearby lakes found stark evidence of relentless megadroughts, periods of severe aridity that could last for decades, crippling agriculture and emptying reservoirs. At the same time, epigraphers finally deciphering Maya glyphs on stone stelae discovered a history not of peaceful priest-kings, but of rampant chronic warfare. City-states locked in escalating cycles of raid and counter-raid, fueled by political ambition and competition for dwindling resources. The grand ceremonial centers were not just temples, they were the hearts of powerful, competing dynasties. The error was in trying to isolate one cause when the collapse was a cascade. Intense warfare made it impossible to coordinate a response to the droughts. The droughts, in turn, put immense strain on the political system, whose rulers derived their power from a promise of prosperity and divine favor. As crops failed and water sources dried up, that legitimacy evaporated. The population did not vanish, they simply left the great urban centers, dispersing into the countryside or migrating to more resilient areas in the north, like Chichen Itza, which flourished for centuries after the southern cities fell silent. The collapse was not an end but a brutal, long-term transformation. It was a process of decentralization, not disappearance. Millions of Maya people live in the region today, the direct descendants of those who adapted and survived. Our era was in seeing an empty jungle and writing a story of a dead civilization, when we should have been looking for the evidence of a society changing form under immense strain. This compels us to ask what other historical declines we have lazily labeled as collapses, simply because we preferred a clean, dramatic ending to a complex, challenging truth. Our next era reveals that sometimes the very methods we trust to uncover the past can be the source of our greatest misunderstandings. Radiocarbon dating promised to end all chronological arguments with a single scientific number. This technique, developed by Willard Libby in the 1940s, gave archaeologists their first true clock, a way to measure the age of organic material directly. The scientific world celebrated, believing we had finally found an infallible key to the past, but that key was cut with a fundamental flaw. The entire method rested on a single, critical assumption that the amount of radioactive carbon-14 in the Earth's atmosphere had always been constant. We now know this was a monumental error. The atmosphere's carbon-14 levels have actually fluctuated dramatically over millennia, influenced by solar activity, the Earth's magnetic field, and even volcanic eruptions. This meant the clock was running at different speeds throughout history, though no one knew it at the time. Those early, uncalibrated dates were published with absolute confidence, becoming the foundation for textbooks and museum plaques worldwide. An Egyptian pyramid might be dated 500 years too old, while a European megalith was declared centuries too young. These were not minor adjustments. They were errors on a scale that could invent phantom gaps in history or make two contemporary cultures seem separated by vast stretches of time. The entire timeline for the peopling of the Americas was thrown into disarray, with early sites receiving impossibly ancient dates that sparked decades of futile academic debate. The correction required a Herculean scientific effort. Researchers had to build a new, accurate calendar by cross-referencing known dates from ancient tree rings and pristine ice cores. This painstaking work produced a calibration curve, a map of the atmosphere's changing chemistry that allowed us to finally translate those flawed radiocarbon readings into true calendar years. But the damage was done. For generations, students learned incorrect chronologies, and theories were built upon a shaky foundation of mistaken time. This episode stands as a permanent lesson in scientific humility. It proves that our most trusted tools are only as good as our underlying assumptions. How many of the dates we currently accept as absolute fact are merely placeholders, waiting for the next technological leap to reveal their true age? The quest for a perfect timeline continues, a race against the very errors we ourselves create. Their reputation as uncultured brutes was a victory for ancient propaganda. The Philistines, immortalized in the Bible as the barbaric foes of the Israelites, have been archaeology's perfect villains for centuries. This caricature was not born from evidence, but from a profound error of interpretation, one that took root when scholars treated the accounts of their enemies as unbiased historical fact. Early excavations at cities like Ashkelon and Gath were not searches for a civilization. They were hunts for confirmation of biblical conflict. Archaeologists arrived with shovels in one hand and scripture in the other, seeking proof of Goliath's defeat or Samson's vengeance. In this single-minded quest, they saw exactly what they expected to see. They noted the destruction layers marking the arrival of the Sea Peoples and catalogued the weapons, reinforcing the image of violent invaders. What they consistently overlooked was the evidence of everything that happened after the battles, the vibrant culture that emerged from the conquest. The error was a failure to see the pottery not as crude imitation, but as a sophisticated blend of Aegean styles and local Canaanite influences. It was a blindness to the advanced metalworking tools and the carefully planned grid of their city streets, which spoke of a people who were builders and administrators, not just destroyers. They were so focused on proving the Philistines were the bad guys that they missed the entire story of who they actually became. Recent archaeology, freed from the chains of textual bias, has completely rewritten this narrative. By analyzing the material culture on its own terms, we have discovered a people with deep connections to the Mycenaean world of the Aegean. Their DNA, their distinctive cooking pots used for pork and dog, their elaborate loom weights for weaving, all point to a complex society of migrants who settled in the Levant and forged a powerful cosmopolitan culture. They were not uncultured brutes, they were a vital part of the international Bronze Age world, facilitating trade and cultural exchange across the Mediterranean. The old, error-filled narrative served a clear purpose for the ancient Israelites. It defined their own identity in opposition to a powerful neighbor. But by accepting that vilification as history, we erased a major player from the Bronze Age stage for thousands of years. How many other ancient peoples are still waiting for their story to be told, still trapped in the caricatures drawn by their rivals? This lesson in looking beyond biased texts to the objects people left behind is a crucial one, a shift in perspective that can rescue entire cultures from the dustbin of mischaracterization. That famous Willendorf figurine with her exaggerated curves was never a goddess of classical myth. She was found not on a temple altar, but buried in the Austrian loess, a small, portable object carved from Ulitic limestone. Yet the moment she was unearthed, she was slapped with a label that would define an entire category of prehistoric art, the Venus. This was a profound misnomer, an error born from the classical education of 19th century scholars who saw the world through a Greco-Roman lens. They projected their own familiar ideals of beauty and divinity onto a Stone Age artist, immediately interpreting the figurine's pronounced breasts, belly, and hips as undeniable evidence of a fertility idol. The same automatic classification was applied to thousands of other statuettes found from France to Siberia, all grouped under the Venus umbrella. This one-size-fits-all interpretation created a simplistic, monolithic narrative of Paleolithic spirituality centered entirely around a mother goddess cult. In doing so, it likely erased a far richer and more diverse reality. Think about the sheer span of time and distance involved. These figurines were created over tens of thousands of years by countless different bands of hunter-gatherers spread across an entire continent. Is it really plausible that every single one of these distinct cultures used these objects for the exact same purpose? The error was in our inability to conceive of multiple meanings. A figurine found in a grave might indeed be a spiritual companion for the afterlife. Another discovered near a hearth could have been a child's doll, a teaching tool, or a cherished family totem. Some may have been stylized self-portraits made by women, representing their own bodies and life experiences. Others might have served as maps of kinship ties or territorial claims, their unique markings encoding information vital to a nomadic group's survival. By forcing them all into the single box of religious artifact, we rendered them silent and uniform. We replaced a potential chorus of individual voices with a single, assumed hymn to fertility. This mistake demonstrates the immense danger of projecting our own cultural baggage onto societies whose worldviews are completely lost to us. We see a rounded form and think goddess, when the original artist may have been thinking of ancestry, play, or simply the comfort of a familiar shape held in the hand. The path to correction requires a more humble, contextual approach. It means studying each statuette not as part of a divine pantheon, but as a solitary find, noting the specific soil it lay in, the other objects it was buried with, and the microscopic wear on its surface from being handled. We must accept that some of their stories are simply unrecoverable, that the full meaning of these enigmatic figures died with the people who carved them. This forces a difficult question: what other prehistoric objects, from cave paintings to carved antler batons, have we hastily categorized and in doing so, permanently limited the vast and unknowable stories they were meant to tell. The thunder of explosives in the Bamiyan Valley did more than shatter stone, it detonated a global failure. In 2001, the Taliban's systematic demolition of the two colossal Buddha statues was an act of modern iconoclasm, but the error belonged to the world. The international community watched, negotiated, and ultimately proved powerless to stop the obliteration of these 6th-century giants. This was not an error of misidentification or careless digging, but a catastrophic failure of preservation in the face of extremist ideology. The statues were not merely religious symbols, they were unique historical documents carved directly into the cliff face. Their very niches held priceless evidence, some of the world's earliest known oil paintings, and a layered record of cultural fusion along the ancient Silk Road. The loss was absolute, permanently deleting a pivotal chapter in the story of Buddhist art and the Gandharan civilization that thrived at the crossroads of East and West. The dynamite blasts forced a painful global reckoning, shattering the comfortable illusion that humanity's shared heritage was somehow safe from the ravages of modern conflict and political fanaticism. This tragic event, however, sparked a crucial shift, leading to the creation of UNESCO emergency response programs and a new, urgent focus on safeguarding endangered sites. The era of Bamiyan lies in our collective complacency, the dangerous belief that such treasures were inviolable. It forces a haunting question upon us all. What other irreplaceable pillars of our shared past are currently standing in the crosshairs of conflict and ideology, and what tangible action are we taking right now to shield them from the same fate? This deliberate, violent erasure of culture stands in stark contrast to the quieter, slower destruction wrought by simple neglect. The desert had given up one of its greatest secrets, only for us to abandon it to the sands once more. The discovery of Ubar, the fabled Atlantis of the sands, was a modern marvel, pinpointed in the early 1990s through a blend of ancient maps, Bedouin lore, and eyes in the sky. Satellite imagery revealed the faint scars of ancient caravan routes, all converging on a single, remote point in Oman's empty quarter. The excavation that followed was a triumph, unearthing the massive stone foundations of a fortress city that had once controlled the entire lucrative frankincense trade. Here was the tangible proof of a legendary hub, a place where fortunes were made from the aromatic resin that was worth its weight in gold. But this victory contained the seed of a devastating new era. The international team packed up, the world moved on, and the site was left virtually alone. The error was not in the finding, but in the forsaking. A discovery is a fragile moment, and without immediate, sustained stewardship, it can vanish faster than the first time. Left exposed in one of the most brutal climates on Earth, Ubar's meticulously uncovered walls began to crumble back into the dunes, scoured by relentless winds and the rare but devastating desert rain. Worse than the elements, however, was the human threat. The site's remote location, once its protection, became its greatest vulnerability. Without guards or a local preservation presence, looters descended, digging pits through ancient floors in search of saleable artifacts, shattering pottery and scattering bones in their haste. The era was a failure of commitment, a classic case of celebrating the headline while forgetting the long, quiet work of conservation. We proved Ubar was real, and then we acted as though our job was done. Now, the same satellite images that once revealed the city might one day show only a field of pits and rubble, a legend lost for a second time. This case forces a difficult question upon the entire field. How many other remote, celebrated discoveries are currently facing the same slow death, not from a single catastrophic event, but from the quiet, corrosive drip of indifference? The race against time does not end when the first artifacts are lifted from the earth. It often only truly begins. A single thread from the edge of a sacred cloth nearly unraveled its entire history. In 1988, 3 separate laboratories performed radiocarbon dating on the Shroud of Turin, the revered linen bearing the ghostly image of a crucified man. The scientific verdict was unanimous and seemingly definitive. The cloth originated not in the 1st century, but in the medieval period between 1260 and 1390. The case appeared closed, a triumph of modern science over ancient superstition. But this certainty was the core of the error. The sample the scientists cut for testing was taken from a single, highly handled corner of the shroud, an area that had been repeatedly grasped by medieval priests and pilgrims during centuries of veneration. Textile experts later raised a profound objection. What if that specific patch of cloth was not original? The shroud survived a severe fire in 1532, and medieval nuns were known for their skill at reweaving damaged relics with new linen threads. The tested sample could easily have been one of these invisible repairs, a patch of medieval thread seamlessly integrated into the edges of an ancient cloth. The fire itself introduced another variable, potentially coating the fibers in carbon-rich soot that would have made the linen test centuries younger than it truly was. The scientific protocol, designed for purity, failed to account for the messy human biography of the object it was testing. The result was not clarity, but a deeper, more polarized mystery. Believers pointed to the flawed methodology to uphold the shroud's authenticity, while skeptics held up the lab results as absolute proof of a forgery. The error transformed a scientific process into a theological battleground, demonstrating that a single, poorly chosen sample can create a schism that lasts for generations. It forces us to confront a difficult question about all manner of controversial artifacts. How many have been prematurely dismissed or authenticated based on a test that was fundamentally compromised at the sampling stage? The allure of a definitive answer is powerful, but the shroud stands as a permanent monument to the principle that science is only as reliable as the human judgment guiding its hand. This collision between faith and empirical data reveals a deeper truth that our tools are fallible, and a mystery preserved is sometimes more valuable than a truth carelessly declared. The sprawling complex of Cahokia was once dismissed as little more than a collection of overgrown hills. Early settlers plowed its slopes, and even trained archaeologists initially catalogued it as a minor ceremonial center built by a simple, local culture. This was a catastrophic failure of vision, a refusal to see the monumental city that once thrived on the Mississippi floodplain. The error was rooted in a deep-seated geographical bias, a conviction that urban sophistication and large-scale engineering were exclusive to the familiar empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes. North America, in this flawed view, was a land of scattered tribes incapable of such collective achievement. The truth, painstakingly uncovered through 20th-century excavations, was staggering. Cahokia was not a village, it was a metropolis. At its peak around the year 1100, it was home to as many as 20,000 people, rivaling contemporary London in population. Its centerpiece, Monk's Mound, remains the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas, a 10-story platform of clay and soil that required moving over 14 million baskets of earth, all by hand. This was not just a big hill, it was the administrative and spiritual heart of a vast chiefdom, overlooking a grand plaza larger than 30 football fields where ceremonies and games drew people from across the continent. The city's engineers aligned its central features with the cosmos, creating a solar calendar of wooden posts known as Woodhenge. Its traders imported copper from the Great Lakes, seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachians. This was a nexus of commerce, religion, and power whose influence stretched for 1,000 miles. The initial dismissal of Cahokia's significance meant that for generations we wrote the history of North America with a crucial chapter missing. We underestimated the political complexity, the artistic expression, and the sheer organizational will of the Mississippian people. By the time we finally looked properly, looters and urban sprawl had already destroyed countless satellite mounds and erased irreplaceable context. How many other landscapes that we casually drive past today are actually the silent, overgrown centers of forgotten empires, waiting for us to shed our preconceptions and truly see what is beneath our feet? Their hunched posture and low brow became a permanent symbol of stupidity. For more than a century after the first fossil was pulled from a German cave, Neanderthals were locked into the role of primitive brutes, shuffling and grunting their way toward an inevitable extinction. This caricature was a profound error, built not on evidence but on a lethal combination of bad luck and deep-seated bias. The original reconstruction, which cemented this image worldwide, was based on a single, elderly skeleton crippled by severe arthritis, its stoop mistakenly interpreted as the natural posture of an entire species. At the same time, Victorian scientists, steeped in notions of progress and racial hierarchy, were desperate to place modern humans on an evolutionary pedestal. They needed a dull-witted, shambling cousin to serve as a foil for our own brilliance. The error was one of anthropological arrogance, an assumption that a different body stockier with a prominent brow ridge meant a lesser mind. This misjudgment was so powerful it blinded researchers to the facts right in front of them. Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than our own. They crafted sophisticated, specialized tools like the Levallois spear point, a multi-step process requiring advanced forethought and skill. They controlled fire, lived in complex social groups, and ritually buried their dead, sometimes even adorning graves with flowers. Recent discoveries have shattered the final pillars of their primitive image. They painted on cave walls in Spain, creating abstract symbols and hand stencils over 60,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. They crafted jewelry from eagle talons and shells, a clear sign of symbolic thought and personal adornment. Perhaps the most humbling correction is written in our own DNA. We now know that early Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals extensively. Most people of non-African descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal genetic code within them, a legacy of intimacy and coexistence, not just conflict. This genetic intimacy proves they were not a separate, inferior branch, but another human species, one we recognized as partners and peers. The old, erroneous model of the dumb caveman hindered our understanding for generations, forcing us to ignore the complex tapestry of interaction, trade, and cultural exchange that must have occurred when our paths crossed. It makes you wonder what other capabilities we are currently denying to other hominin species, like the enigmatic Denisovans, simply because their bones look strange to us. This final correction strips away our arrogant claim to unique intelligence and replaces it with a more profound truth that humanity was for a time a wonderfully diverse family. While Pompeii was entombed in soft ash, Herculaneum was flash-frozen by a superheated wave of volcanic gas and mud that hardened into a rock-like seal 20 meters deep. This very preservation became the source of its archaeological tragedy. 18th-century explorers wielding picks and gunpowder did not see a city, they saw a marble quarry. They sank deep, claustrophobic tunnels through the solidified mass, their only goal to spear priceless statues and strip colorful mosaics from the walls of buried villas. These treasure shafts were not excavations, They were surgical strikes against history, carving through homes and forums without any record of what was destroyed in the process. A tunnel might burst into a dining room, its painted frescoes carefully cut from the walls, while the carbonized wooden cradle in the next room was smashed to splinters and kicked aside as worthless. The era was a brutal calculation of value, where a bronze bust was worth a fortune, and the context of the home it adorned was considered worthless overburden. Even when systematic digging began, a new kind of bias took hold. The discovery of the Villa of the Papyri, with its unparalleled library of carbonized scrolls and its trove of exquisite bronze sculptures, became an all-consuming obsession. For decades, the world's attention and much of the funding was funneled into this one luxurious estate. Archaeologists acted like intellectual treasure hunters themselves, meticulously unrolling scrolls in hopes of lost Greek texts, while the rest of Herculaneum, the bakeries, the fish sauce shops, the cramped apartments of ordinary citizens, lay largely ignored. The era was a failure to see the city as a whole. We knew everything about how the elite of Herculaneum lived and thought, but for a long time we knew almost nothing about the people who baked their bread or mended their nets. The complete story of Herculaneum's social fabric, its economy, and its diverse population had to wait for modern archaeology to shift its gaze from the spectacular villa to the vibrant, crowded streets. We are still piecing together the lives of its middle class and poor from the evidence that survived the early tunnelers and the later fixation on luxury. What stories of daily commerce and family life were permanently erased by those initial, greed-driven shafts? This preference for the spectacular over the mundane is a recurring temptation, one that leads us directly to our final, and perhaps most subtle, error of all. The sea has always been our greatest storyteller, but now it is becoming our most efficient eraser. For generations, archaeologists treated the coastline as a permanent boundary, a stable stage where the ruins of ancient ports and settlements could be patiently studied for centuries to come. This assumption was one of the most costly modern errors, a collective failure to predict how swiftly climate change would redraw the map of our past. Rising sea levels and intensifying coastal erosion are not future threats. They are present-day realities, actively dissolving the very ground beneath our history. In Florida, ancient Native American shell middens, built over thousands of years, are crumbling into the surf, taking with them the only records of unique coastal cultures. In Greenland, the permafrost that once preserved Viking longhouses and their contents is thawing, exposing organic artifacts to rot and disintegration after centuries of perfect preservation. Across the Mediterranean, the stone foundations of Phoenician harbors and Roman villas are being undermined by saltwater and battered by increasingly violent storms. The era was not one of ignorance but of inaction. The science was clear, yet the field was slow to launch large-scale, proactive rescue missions in these vulnerable zones. The traditional pace of archaeology, methodical and deliberate, is no match for the accelerating pace of environmental change. We are now in a desperate race against the tides, forced to practice salvage archaeology on a global scale. The tragedy is compounded by a chronic lack of funding and coordination, meaning that for every site we manage to document with 3D scanning and emergency digs, a dozen others vanish unnoticed. This is an era of foresight, a failure to fully integrate the preservation of cultural heritage into our global climate action plans. We are watching history dissolve in real time, losing entire chapters of the human story not to a single cataclysm, but to the slow, inexorable rise of the sea. What profound insights into human adaptation, what lost migrations and forgotten technologies, will be swallowed by the waves simply because we understood the threat too late to stop it. These 26 eras share a single, humbling origin. Archaeology is a human science, and every human endeavor is vulnerable to the flaws of its practitioners. Our greatest discoveries are filtered through a lens of technological limits, cultural bias, and the simple, seductive power of a good story. A pioneer like Schliemann was blinded by his obsession with Homeric legend, while the scientific community of the Piltdown era was swayed by national pride. We look at the silent past and try to make it speak, but we often only hear the echo of our own voices, our own desires for a world that fits our expectations. The consequences of these missteps are far from academic. A misidentified mound in America did not just confuse a timeline, it fueled a destructive myth of a lost white race that was used to justify the seizure of native lands and the erasure of indigenous history. A misdated city wall in Jericho was presented as proof of divine intervention, warping religious education for generations. The commercial looting of sites like did not just rob museums of beautiful objects, it shredded the very context that would have told us how the first cities functioned, how their people loved, traded, and governed. These are not harmless mistakes. They are errors that have shaped national identities, validated prejudices, and irrevocably narrowed our understanding of the human journey. Recognizing this inherent fallibility is not an attack on archaeology. It is the very practice of strengthening it. Each blunder, from the radiocarbon dating fiasco to the invention of the Minoan piece, has forced the field to become more rigorous. It has pushed us toward grid systems and stratigraphic analysis, toward interdisciplinary collaboration with chemists, geneticists, and climatologists. The entire discipline progresses by constantly questioning its own foundational assumptions, by being willing to say that what we knew for certain yesterday was wrong. This self-correcting mechanism is what transforms archaeology from a mere collection of artifacts into a dynamic, living pursuit of truth. So where does that leave us, the audience for these grand historical narratives? It leaves us with a responsibility to be thoughtful consumers. The next time you read a headline about a world-altering discovery or watch a documentary presenting a tidy version of the past, pause. Ask where the evidence came from, question who funded the dig, wonder about the voices, especially indigenous or local ones, that might have been overlooked in the excitement. The most powerful tool in archaeology is not the shovel or the satellite, but a persistent, healthy skepticism. This reflection on our own role in interpreting history brings us to the final, overarching lesson these 26 eras have to teach. Our journey through these 26 blunders uncovers a fragile truth. History is not a solid monument we walk around, but a story we are always rewriting. Every misstep, from the forged Piltdown skull to Schliemann's brutal trench at Troy, carries a vital lesson. We learn the cost of national pride, the danger of romanticizing myth, and the profound injustice of erasing indigenous achievement, as with the myth of the mound builders. These are not simple tales of failure. They are chapters in the epic, relentless human drive to know where we came from. This drive is our greatest strength, but it must be guided by a new humility and an unwavering commitment to rigorous method. The stones and bones themselves are silent. It is our responsibility to listen without prejudice, to excavate with care, and to preserve with passion, especially now as climate change threatens to erase coastal history forever. The past itself is immutable, but our understanding of it is a living, breathing thing, forever evolving. We would love to hear which of these eras you find most startling. Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for exploring the shadows of history with us.